The story that doesn't work. There was once a people, let's call them the people. The people use stories to interpret their lives. Stories of where they came from, stories of where they're going. Stories that tell them how to be happy. Stories that tell them where they are. The stories say that one day, a long time ago, one of the people saw another one of the people holding something shiny. I want it, said one of the people, so he took it. When he got back home that night, the rest of the people were amazed. Because I have a shiny object, he proclaimed, you have to listen to me. And he told them a story about what he had learned, about how to be happy, how to have peace and security, how to keep the shining thing that he had found. The first story said that the way to be happy is to rule over others. But every time that story was attempted, people were unhappy because the rulers oppressed them. So another story was invented. Let's overthrow the rulers. This story didn't work either, because it just turned the tables, putting new people under oppression. So another story began, in which the old revolutionaries withdrew into their own isolated spaces and judged the world. But nothing changed, because these island communities used the same old stories to run themselves, competing to be in charge, building shiny object factories which blew ugly smoke into the air, making everyone cough, and dominating each other. Meanwhile, the domination story and the isolation story had a business merger, which resulted in an experiment. If they could get rid of the people they didn't like, who looked or sounded different, or whose customs weren't like their own, surely that would fix things. But that story just led to more suffering, of those who were blamed and targeted and who felt unsafe, and of those who thought they were in charge because they missed out on the gift of the rainbow. They lived in a gray world. The people still weren't happy, and they knew it. A lot of years went by. The people tried to convince themselves that things were okay by accumulating things. Toys or nations, it was all the same to them. Some of the people knew such things don't heal the soul, and the other stories hadn't gone away either. The people kept hurting and hurting each other. So a final story was created that said if we couldn't find peace, security, and happiness by ruling the world, or withdrawing to isolation, or getting rid of a minority they didn't like, or by accumulating things, maybe they could make sure that they never forget this lack, this pain that others had caused them, and the suffering they had experienced. The people would make sure that no one would ever forget they were the victims, that their suffering was their very identity, and that no one had suffered as much as them. And if you try to tell them that others have suffered too, they might kill you. And then something new. A poet came to town. A storyteller who knew that the domination story, the revolution story, the isolation story, the purification story, the accumulation story, and the victimization story were all destined to fail. Because they invited every human being who is already interdependent with every other human being, and even with the earth itself, to pretend that we are in a competition instead. The poet knew how to build things, like tables, where we could all sit and eat together. She taught that the people most oppressed by the six stories should be the most honored. She taught that the kinds of differences that the people's stories shame or use an excuse for punishment were actually marks of what makes us most lovable. She invited people to join her in forming a new community, where status would depend on service, where domination would be replaced by equitable community, where the revolution of the heart would lead us to share power with, not power over, transforming the process by which we lead and learn, where deadening isolation would be replaced by rejuvenating silences, where we would learn from and celebrate folk on the margins, where we would share, not possess, and heal each other's wounds in a new story, not of victimhood or power over, but of forgiving each other, co-conspiring only beauty. The poet had a radical idea. the seed of a new story that will heal the world, that will heal the world. The 6 earlier stories all claim that the path to peace, security, and happiness was about winning. Us over them, or us overthrowing them, or us staying apart from them, or us cleansing ourselves of them, or us having things that they don't, or us being more important than them because of our competitive suffering. But in the new story, the story of reconciliation, we still get to win, just not at anybody else's expense. In the new story, human beings are not the protagonist of the world. God is. Love is. In the new story, humans are participants in something far bigger than being reduced to dominating others for one group's pain, or the pursuit of happiness through revolutions that replace one dominance with another, or isolation, or purity, or being a victim, or gaining possessions. In the new story, humans are participants in the biggest thing that has ever happened, of the evolution of good, of the expansion of consciousness, to include the restoration and healing of all things. The story of love. God's story of His Son, Jesus. It's a story in which some of us know that our purpose is not merely ourselves, but all of us. Some of us, for all of us. They killed the poet, of course. The new story was too much to take for people with visions limited to the narrow circle of self. But the poet did not actually die. Our story is alive right now. The story lives wherever someone reveals the other stories as failures. The story lives every time someone lives for all of us, or offers a glass of water to a thirsty stranger, or a blanket for a naked person, or engages in sacred practices of friendship, lament, and hope. The story lives wherever there are exchanges of power and gifts between the strong and the vulnerable, creating a new community. This is God's story. Amen.